So, welcome to another episode of GeoAwesome Talk. We have Josh Weiner joining us from Maxar today, and we're going to be talking about satellites, 3D insights, and all that. But before we get into the episode and all of that, I want to introduce you to my co-host, Alex.
Thanks, Muru. So the topic of the episode today will be super interesting. When we discussed with Muru what is the next big thing in Earth observation, we found out about a lot of different innovation, but one of the topics that we found the most under discussed and also not understood, is 3D, right? 3D that we take for granted because we all know it from Google Earth and other platforms, but actually making it work for the global scale at the very high resolution based on satellite data, it's a huge challenge, and it's a very complicated technical and operational problem. So we've done a little bit of digging, and we found out Maxar and Josh, who are leading the charge in the game of satellite-based 3D. And we've invited Josh to do a deep dive into this topic with us and share a little bit of insights of how things actually look like behind the stages. Josh, maybe let's begin with a bit of intro from yourself, your background, and your role at Maxar.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Alex. Thank you. So my name is Josh Weiner, and ever since I was very little, I've always had an interest in looking up at the sky and in space. And for the last 14 years, I've kind of flipped that, and I've been looking down on the Earth through the lens of our satellites at Maxar. My role here is the Senior Director of Enterprise Sales, and myself and my team are responsible for bringing our high-resolution imagery, our derived products like 3D data to the consumer and enterprise markets, which includes automotive, telco, consumer mapping, energy, and others.
Josh, so let's start from the beginning. Why creating satellite-based high-resolution 3D maps is so challenging, and particularly when we think about mapping the entire world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's interesting because your question kind of speaks to how far we have come as an industry, in the fact that we take a global scale, two-dimensional, high-resolution map as granted now. We just expect that anywhere we look on the planet, we're going to be able to see in high resolution a current perspective of what the planet looks like. Now we're trying to apply that to 3D, and we wonder why that is so challenging. And the reality is 3D requires orders of more magnitude data and processing to build out. So when you create a two-dimensional mosaic of the Earth, you're using a single image over a single location on the planet. When you're building out the Earth in 3D, there are a couple of different ways you can do it. The way we do it at Maxar is a unique and proprietary technology that's built into our Precision3D product that leverages what's called multi-view photogrammetry. And what that really translates to is, instead of needing a single image to create that 2D mosaic, to build the world in 3D, you need 10, 20, sometimes 30 or more images of a single location to build that accurate 3D map. And the more complex the terrain is, like canyons and mountains, buildings, vegetation, dense city centers, the more data you need for that 3D. And so the real challenge behind this is having a deep enough archive, having enough capacity on a constellation of satellites to collect new imagery, and then having the processing capability to put all that together and build that 3D perspective. So it is very challenging, but we've made a lot of progress towards building out that global skin today.
Thanks, Josh. You spoke a little bit about the challenges that you face in creating this 3D product. Could we dig in a bit more deeper into the technical hurdles, and how does satellite data play a role in it?
Yeah, absolutely. So historically, when you build a 3D model of a location, you would use what's called stereoscopic imagery. And what that really means is, whether it's being collected from an airplane or being collected from a satellite, you intentionally collect an image of a certain location from two complementary look angles. So if you're going over an object, you want to make sure you look at it from one side and then you look at it from the other. And with that, you can create a 3D model. The way that we're doing this at Maxar is instead of using the scarce resource of capacity on our constellation, we are leveraging our deep archive, which goes back over 20 years, 125 petabytes of data. And we're looking at fortuitously collected images to stitch together to create that 3D perspective. So the models that go into how we determine which images to use, how those images are stitched together, how we prioritize those different look angles, and how we prioritize more current images so that we have the most current perspective of the Earth in 3D is all part of that challenge.
So I guess that it's really trying to make it in a smart way, right? So you are trying to use all of the resources that you have and figure out the technology and the process to actually leverage it. And I like it a lot. But there is this element of resolution, right? So there is this 50 centimeters that seems to be like a holy grail of the elevation data resolution in the industry, right? So is it more difficult to do that for at a global scale at this resolution? Like, what are the challenges with that, and maybe what are some of the next steps as well going forward when it comes to what can we expect of the resolution of the future?
Yeah. So you mentioned 50 centimeter resolution as being the industry standard, and we're actually moving towards 30 centimeter and building out a global skin at 30 centimeter from space, with satellites. And then even taking that a step further and being able to process that with HD or high definition capabilities down to a 15 centimeter equivalent. We're really pushing the boundary of what high resolution means, where it used to mean 50 to 60 centimeter, and we're now moving to even sub 30. So the higher the resolution you want to build a model or you want to build a skin or a mosaic of, the more content you're going to have, right? So if you think about satellites like the Landsat 7, 8, and 9 satellites that are collecting at a 15 meter resolution, they're able to image the entire planet every couple of weeks. And so you have this low resolution skin of the Earth constantly being updated because you're looking at it through a very wide aperture, right? Through a wide angle. When you build out the world in 30 centimeter or 15 centimeter or even 50 centimeter, you're collecting very narrow or very small images and stitching all those together over time. And so the challenge is in having enough capacity to collect all that content and then to recollect it again to make sure that you're maintaining a fresh perspective of that. From a 2D perspective, we image the entire planet on an annual basis. We stitch together all those images into a mosaic, and that ranges from 30 to 50 centimeter native resolution. And then we HD a lot of that, especially over major metropolitan areas and changing parts of the planet to 15 centimeter resolution. As we start to do this with 3D, we want to build out that 3D model first, and then we want to continue to update it on that same annual cadence that we do with 2D. But it requires a ton of data because, as I mentioned, in order to build a 3D model using our capabilities, we use 10, 15, even 20 different images. And if you think about the Earth's landmass being 135 million square kilometers, if you have to collect that 10, 20, 30 times, you're literally talking about billions of square kilometers of imagery being processed into a 3D model, being reviewed and QA'd by a team of experts, and then having that data hosted and available for consumers and end users. So it is a huge challenge, but we're up to the challenge of moving and pushing that definition of what's expected from what was historically even 15 meter and 30 meter in 3D. When you look at the SRTM shuttle radar topography missions that were collected in 2000 to where we are now, it's incredible how far we've come.
It's not just incredible, it's really crazy. It's like within 20 years, we're talking orders of magnitude better and not just one mission, but on a regular basis so that you could use it for several industries. So I guess it's fair to say Precision 3D as a product is rather unique. And some of the things that you mentioned earlier sounds very similar to photogrammetry, but I'm pretty sure it's not the same. So from a technical perspective and talking rather, in terms of evolution of the technology, how does this differ from what we've done in the past?
Yeah, so it's a good question. A lot of the global scale, and dare I say, all the global scale 3D models that have been built up until now, up until our Precision 3D product, have been derived from a radar-based sensor, right? Typically a SAR sensor. If you look at SRTM, if you look at some of the other commercial companies in this space who are trying to build out the world in 3D, it's often built from a SAR sensor. We're taking a different perspective where we realize we have this incredibly deep archive of electro-optical imagery, and all that imagery has been collected at all these different look angles. And so it's really the adoption of this multi-view capability, and instead of just depending on two stereoscopic images that were very intentionally collected, and being able to leverage all the fortuitously collected multi-view images that actually complement one another when all used together, where you can take that. And then, of course, the biggest challenge here, one of the biggest challenges is figuring out how to build a model that can determine which images to use and stitch all those together to build that 3D model. And that's really the secret sauce behind Precision 3D. And that's what enables us to build the world out at scale. This product has been around for less than 10 years, and we've already built out about 70% of the Earth's landmass, right? Over 90 million square kilometers. And so, we're really trying to push the limits on how quickly we can build out this global skin and then maintain that with a more current model on an annual basis, which is incredibly dependent on us continuing to launch new satellites like our Legion satellites, which are launching this year and have launched this year, and leveraging all that content that they're collecting.
When we talk about the 2D landscape and the 3D landscape in the sense that buildings go up, buildings go down, the competition for Maxar has also changed a lot over the last 20 years as well. And in a sense, the 2D space is quite crowded today. There are a lot of different companies competing for the same market share. How does your approach compare to your competitors when it comes to 3D?
Yeah, there are orders of magnitude more satellites in orbit today than there were 14 years ago when I started working at Maxar. And those satellites range from Earth imaging satellites that could be electro-optical, that could be synthetic aperture radar. There's communication satellites. There's a vast array of satellites in orbit now that were not even just recently. And many of those do compete or offer, in many cases, complementary imagery to what we collect. The reality is there's only a handful of satellites in orbit that can collect at the highest resolution available today, which is that 30 centimeter native resolution. And we feel very comfortable in the head start that we have on the industry with launching the first of those satellites in WorldView 3, and then another 6 that are going up this year. We launched 2 earlier this year from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, another 2 a few months later out of Cape Canaveral, and we're excited to launch another 2 in the not too distant future to launch all 6 of these Legion satellites. So we're tripling our 30 centimeter capacity of 30 centimeter resolution capacity of satellites. We know that other satellite operators will continue to push that as well. And it's a matter of not just launching these satellites, but how you can build products like 3D from them. You create an incredible amount of data, right? I talked about 125 petabytes. It's hard to even fathom what that feels like and what that looks like. But collecting a ton of data is only as useful as the ability to disseminate that and to build products that are valuable to customers out of that. So it's not just launching satellites, but it's building those products and being able to understand and take those signals from the market of what people want and need.
For sure, and it's super exciting that the Legion will be finally, up there and capturing data, because there is just a handful of very, very high resolution constellations out there and satellites out there, right? So, I mean, adding 6 more will actually increase it by like 50%, right? So it's a really exciting news for the entire industry. But let's look a little bit into applications of this data, right? You've mentioned a couple of them that are kind of obvious for majority of us, flooding, disaster management, maybe urban planning. But what are some of the other maybe less obvious applications of those very high resolution 3D data?
Yeah, so it's interesting when you think about the life cycle of a new technology, and this is, I think, even more true and relevant when you think about space-based technology. GPS is a great example of a technology that the initial use cases are often government-driven, whether that's civil or defense-related. And we've talked about some of the civil applications for our 3D data with things like disaster response and flood modeling and that kind of thing. To me, what gets really interesting is when that technology and when that capability propagates all the way down to the consumer level. When you take something that was initially designed for government users and it's now, in the pocket of every person on the planet or on the wrist of every person on the planet, that level of technology dissemination is where really interesting use cases begin to become apparent. And so it's not just consumer, but it's also enterprise applications. And so if you think about what some of those are, there are two that I think are really interesting because they are kind of interdependent with one another, and they both rely on having a three-dimensional map to operate properly. And those are the telecommunication advancements that have been made and the automotive or transportation advancements that are made. And so more specifically, as we move from a 4G or an LTE-based telecommunication network to 5G, the antenna signal and the capabilities behind 5G require a very different line of sight and propagation model than 4G does, where 5G is actually so sensitive that even things like dense vegetation and buildings can interfere with that signal in ways that you didn't have to worry about quite as much with 4G and LTE. And so in order to build out those 5G networks efficiently and effectively, you have to have a very accurate 3D model. And it has to be very current. When I talk about vegetation, even if you think about a tree that may grow, a foot per year, that could impact the location of an antenna placement for a 5G network. And so we work closely with mobile network operators and telecommunication companies to provide those very accurate 3D models to assist in their deployment of 5G. And then I also mentioned automotive. What's interesting is all these vehicles that are on the road now are really just, they're mobile sensors, and they're all connected to the network, right? And so in order for all these vehicles to collect the amount of data that they do from onboard sensors, to localize themselves with those onboard sensors, they have to have access to a map, right? So a vehicle doesn't know where it is unless there's a map that can help reflect that. So the car has a GPS signal that tells its location, which is only accurate to a certain extent. These vehicles are then using localization technology and capabilities such as onboard sensors that can say, oh, there's a sign there or a bench or another piece of roadside furniture. And then it can reference a base map that it has to say, okay, based on the location of that roadside furniture, I know exactly where I am as a vehicle. And as we move to autonomous vehicles and self-driving cars, and even just electric vehicles that really need to understand the terrain that they're driving on for things like range estimating, the importance of having that accuracy in every direction, both latitudinally, longitudinally, and from an elevation perspective, becomes important. So the reality is these autonomous vehicles depend on a network that is always connected, and these always connected networks depend on an accurate 3D map for deployment. And so I find those two to be very interesting in how they interact with one another. And I'm excited about the role mapping, location, and 3D data plays in enabling that.
It's kind of fascinating to see the fact that, the 3D model that Maxar builds is also benefiting from the fact that you are a satellite data provider and have remote sensing experience from the get-go. I mean, it's one thing to have a 3D model that says, hey, the height of the tree is 10 meters today, but it's another thing to be able to predict that this is a bamboo tree and this is probably going to be growing X meters every year. And therefore, when they plan their telecommunication antennas, that they probably have to factor it into place. That's really fascinating for me. But that's on, let's say, the enterprise side of things. And I know that Alex was very interested in focusing also on the consumer applications.
Yeah, exactly. So we hear a lot about VR, AR, and though you've also mentioned automotive. So what are the main consumer applications that you see of this 3D satellite data? What can we expect in the near future and perhaps long-term future?
Yeah, the consumer applications for 3D or really any of these kind of space-based technologies are also what I get the most excited about and are the most interesting to me. Because once you enable a world of developers to integrate this type of data, this 3D data, into an application that consumers can then access, as easy as pulling their phone out and clicking a button, the use cases start to run wild. One that I'm very passionate about is within the consumer mapping space is the outdoor recreation applications for 3D mapping. Now, for a long time, we've referenced where we are, when we're exploring in the world, whether it's in an urban environment or in a rural or in a mountainous region. We love to pull out a map, see where we are, look at a satellite image to provide that added perspective. But the ability to do that in 3D has really only started to grow and to begin. And so, an example of this, just 2 weeks ago, I was on this bike packing trip across Utah. And, this applies whether you're riding a bike across a vast area, you could be backcountry skiing in Colorado, you could be hiking in Yosemite. And to have an understanding of the terrain that you're walking on or biking on or skiing on is not just a convenience, but it's a safety issue. On this bikepacking trip that I referenced, we covered 20,000 feet of elevation change. And fortunately, we knew that going into it because we had everything mapped out, we had our route planned, and we looked at that in 3D. Had we gone into that blind and not had an understanding for the elevation change and the terrain that we were going to conquer each day, it would have been a very different trip. We would have been a lot less prepared. And so as you see applications like Strava and FatMap and Garmin and all these other consumer outdoor recreation tools make this 3D data incredibly accessible, you start to really open up how well we can be planned and how we can prepare from a safety perspective, to understand whether terrain is an avalanche risk, for example, or whether it's safe to hike through a certain canyon. So those consumer applications to me get incredibly exciting. And it's not just outdoor recreation, it's also just our everyday life. One of the first things we all do when we get in our cars, we plug our phone in so that we have that map in front of us, or we rely on that in-dash map. As we move towards 3D, it provides that additional perspective to help us with those things like, range estimating with electric vehicles, and understanding where we are with respect to the terrain around us.
As you know, Josh, from our pre-interview, I'm super excited about all the outdoor hiking and skiing topics. So indeed, I'm a big user of, for example, FatMap. So here in Europe, it's actually super useful for backcountry skiing. And I mean, it really increases the safety of ski tours and how do you plan your routes, and it's something that really has a big impact on consumer market from that perspective. And I mean, you will not be able to do that without having data, right? So 50 centimeters data, I think that, or 30 centimeters data, I think that this is really a game changer for a lot of people now looking for adventures outdoors. So I'm super excited about this one specifically.
Yeah, this is a topic I could go on all day about. It's my favorite. You know, Alex, you mentioned FatMap, and there's a really good example of something that they have done that is kind of unique with mapping. So historically, when you build a consumer-facing map, you want to have the most beautiful, lush imagery that is peak summertime with the sun high in the sky, with leaves on the trees, so that it looks as beautiful as possible. But what FatMap started to realize was a lot of their users are interacting with their product in the wintertime when they're skiing, when they're snowshoeing, when they're doing these winter mountainous activities. And if you're on a backcountry ski tour and you're trying to identify exactly where you are, looking at a map that was collected in the summertime isn't quite as relevant. And so what FatMap has done is they've started to integrate winter imagery intentionally into their consumer facing application, which has really never been done before. It's not typically people are trying to filter out that snowy imagery and that winter imagery. But as you begin to build maps that are very focused for these use cases and they become very niche, you start to do things like, oh, maybe we want winter imagery when we're enabling an application that's for mountain exploring. Maybe we want 3D data when it's going to be in an area that is, you know, a lot of terrain undulation. So I think it's been very interesting how the consumer market has started to really push how we customize these maps and build them for those specific needs and use cases.
I kind of felt that this is going to become an episode where the two of you talk for the next half an hour about skiing and outdoor activities. So I'm going to get you back because that would be an entire episode. I mean, talk to me when you can I can use a product and I can look at the concert from different angles, whether that's Taylor Swift or Linkin Park, and that's an application I'm willing to pay for. I guess I'm not.
I'm happy to talk. That's my other passion. I actually just told our team here that I bailed on a concert last night because I wanted to be fresh this morning. But you know, imagine a venue like Mutu. I'll take the challenge. Imagine a venue like Red Rocks out here in Colorado. It's this really beautiful outdoor amphitheater that backs up to the mountains, and it is there's a 3D perspective to that is incredibly interesting. When you look at Red Rocks from a top-down perspective in 2 dimensions, it's cool if you know what it is, but if you don't know what it is, you don't know what you're looking at. When you look at that in 3D, and you know you apply that to like an AR or a VR application, and you put Taylor Swift on that stage, all of a sudden you have a really cool concert experience where it feels like you're at Red Rocks, but you need that in 3D. You need that in 15 or 30 centimeter resolution. So it absolutely that may be the next application is AR VR concerts. I love it.
Yeah, let's make that happen. I mean, next time we meet Taylor Swift, which is probably next weekend, right? If I remember correct, let's talk to her and see what she has to say.
After she listens to this, I'm sure that she'll be reaching out.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, moving away from the possibilities of what we can do with 3D, we spoke a lot about the technology and what makes it unique. We've spoken about Precision3D as a product. We've also spoken a lot about applications. I want to talk a little bit about the limitations and the challenges, and not because it's negative, but rather to understand what's possible, what are the challenges, and also to push the technology forward. You mentioned at the very beginning that one of the challenges that you guys see is the geography in terms of whether that's urban environments, whether that's environments where there might be cloud coverage and so on. So let's dive into that part of it. What are really the current challenges, the limitations? Where do you see the need to focus and to improve and get better?
Yeah, mapping is a great industry to look at through the lens of what are the challenges, because a map is never complete. The second a map is created, it's effectively out of date, right? If you want to take it down to that most finite level, if you want to map every tree, every fence, every building, every entrance to a building, every window, there you can map to such a finite level that you're essentially building a 1-to-1 scale map of the planet. And until you get to that, you have challenges, right? And so from a 3D perspective, we do face different challenges than we do from a 2D perspective. Some of the biggest challenges in creating 3D models are doing so in those dense urban canyons, because as you look at a metropolitan area in 3D, tall buildings begin to create that occlusion challenge where they're actually blocking the roads that are underneath them, and they're blocking the view of other buildings around them. So you really need a lot of different look angles so that you can see every perspective of that building, and how you manage things like the shadows that they cast on roads and on buildings becomes very challenging. So 3D and even 2D mapping, so some of that challenge is in building out those more challenging environments. Another part of that challenge is in prioritizing what your definition of quality is. And that's something that I hear a lot is, well, I just want the best image, or I want the best 3D model. But that really depends on what your use case is. The best might be, I want it to be the highest resolution, and it's okay if that image is 10 years old, because I'm, trying to get an image of a mountainous area or a rural area or a forested area. But if you're trying to look at a new development outside of Las Vegas, even if you have the most beautiful image, if it's 10 years old, it's probably going to show you an empty field, which is now a neighborhood. So for that use case, the definition of best may be, I would take a lower quality or lower resolution image, but it has to be collected in the last 3 months because this development is rapidly expanding. And so the same thing is true with 3D. When we build a 3D model with 10, 20, or 30 images, part of that challenge is understanding, well, which images should we include in this model? If we include these older images, maybe they have better look angles or better sun elevation angles. And so they will optimize certain characteristics, but they won't be quite as current. And so we're constantly trying to figure out how to optimize these models to overcome that challenge, to provide something that addresses the quality needs of kind of someone who needs something current, someone who needs something beautiful or high resolution. And so that is one of the biggest challenges I would say that we have is creating something that addresses those unique requirements of all these different use cases, because they're always different and they're always changing.
You've also mentioned that there will be 6 more satellites, up there. So how increasing the number of images will help you out in sorting out some of those challenges. But I mean, having much more data can actually create more challenges as well.
Yeah. So you're talking about our Legion satellites that are going up right now. So 4 of them are in orbit right now. We actually just yesterday announced our initial operating capability on 2 of those satellites. So incredibly excited to see the imagery that those satellites are collecting now being integrated into all of our products, from our online hosted platform, which we call MGP Pro, or our Maxar Geospatial Platform Pro, where you can immediately have access to all that data that we're collecting, integrating those new images into our 3D models, into our 2D mosaics. So we've begun, you mentioned 6 going up, 2 of them are already contributing to all of our products. Another 2 are just being onboarded and calibrated right now, and another 2 are just getting ready for launch. So it will provide a lot more imagery and a lot more of that source content. It means our storage costs are certainly going to go up as we continue to collect all this data, but we're incredibly excited about what that enables from a product perspective. Better 3D models, better 2D mosaics, and the ability to really address all those different use cases, so that we're now collecting imagery, not just in the summertime and in the wintertime, not just leaf on and leaf off, but now with Legion, we're starting to collect in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, as these satellites actually have different orbits. And so more specific on that, these Legion satellites, historically, all of the Maxar constellation that we've operated has been in what's called a sun-synchronous orbit, meaning they orbit the Earth vertically or around the poles, right? And so they're on a north to south collection orbit, and that's when they're collecting that imagery. They go back around the planet from south to north in the dark side of the planet, and then they collect again. And the way that works is it means that you're always collecting in roughly the mid part of the day, from say 11 o'clock in the morning to 1 o'clock in the afternoon local time. And that's very much intentional, because that's when the sun is highest in the sky and the sun is our flash. We need that. when you start to work with different orbits like we're doing with Legion, where we're going to launch into these mid-inclination orbits, you now create a scenario where you have a lot more refresh capability in the most populated part of the planet between the mid or in the mid latitudes, but you're also able to collect at these different times of day. So now we can collect at 9 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And that enables myriad new use cases, the same way collecting leaf on and leaf off in summer and winter imagery has. Now you can work around different shadow challenges that you may have had, and you can start to get those different look angles as well that are so important for building out the world in 3D. So Legion, it is going to create a very unique capability for us, not just in the capacity of 30 centimeter imagery, but in the way that they're going to operate, the way that they're going to collect, and the way that they're going to contribute to our expanding archive.
So that you're going to be collecting a lot of data. So I guess this is the right time for all of us to go back and invest in magnetic tapes, or how do you guys store your data these days?
Yeah, so surprisingly or not surprisingly, this data is primarily stored on the cloud. We want to make it as accessible. So collecting all this data is really only as useful as your ability to get it into the hands of a user, whether that's consumer, enterprise, government. And so that really does mean, putting data as close to the edge as possible in the hands of those users. All of our data is immediately stored on a cloud storage infrastructure, and then integrated into these products. I mentioned this MGP Pro platform, and that's really our platform that we've invested heavily in to take all those, nearly 4 million square kilometers of imagery that we collect on a daily basis, right? And that imagery is spread all over the planet. If you collapse that 4 million square kilometers into one area, that's about the size of India. That's what we collect every single day. And we want to make that imagery and those derived products available and accessible to everyone. And we do that through this online platform. So if you're a developer, you can take the MGP API and you can integrate imagery directly into your application. Or if you're a civil planner or a city worker or even a consumer, you can now start to easily see that imagery. I was just the other day looking at, we talked about the hurricanes in Florida, looking at the path of destruction that they left. We can see imagery that we've collected, just hours after an event like that. And so it's a lot of data we're collecting, but we're making, equal investments in launching these new satellites as we are in making all that content and capacity available and accessible.
And here I was thinking that clouds are not the favorite when it comes to satellite imagery. I mean,
yeah, that's always been kind of a joke in our industry for sure. Yeah, we can't see through clouds yet. If we could figure that out, it'd be great. But we do leverage, another type of cloud.
Yeah, that was a very bad joke on my part. I would work
that was pretty bad. We can edit that out.
Yeah, I definitely think so. But Aleks I'm pretty sure he's going to leave it there.
For sure.
I mean, speaking about collecting a lot more data, you've kind of outlined a bit of your future plan in terms of the next satellites that are coming up and so on. But what are your future plans when it comes to enhancing the quality and the availability of 3D data? Because at the end of the day, that's going to be an aspect that's going to occupy your thinking process and your work process for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. So we mentioned there's three things, right? If you really think about the future of 3D at Maxar, first off, we want to complete our creation of the planet in 3D. We want to hit that, as near to 100%. There may be parts of Greenland that no one is interested in looking at in 3D. I think it's interesting, and I love the idea of completion. So we want to build out the world in 3D. And then we want to immediately begin to update those areas so that they reflect our constantly changing planet. Things are changing on a daily basis, and we want to make sure that our maps, both 2D and 3D, reflect those changes. And then lastly, and maybe even most importantly, as we mentioned, is making all that accessible. The 2D content, as we mentioned earlier in this discussion, is table stakes and is an expectation that you can open your phone and you probably have a half dozen applications on your phone that provide you a 2D look of the planet. We want to do the same thing with 3D. We want to make 3D that same level of expectation that anywhere you look, you can understand, what is what is the difference in elevation of this object and that object, not just where do you see it on a two-dimensional plane. And so taking these 3D products and making them accessible, it is a challenge. It's not the same capability as 2D, right? To take a 2D mosaic and tile it out in a way that all these applications can integrate it and disseminate it to consumers, it's very different to do the same thing with 3D. There's different tiling capabilities and different datums that are involved in that. And so we're working with our partners to understand how they can do that. And we're making our own developments internally with things like MGP Pro to make that data incredibly accessible. So that really is the future. It's actually not for us to decide. The future is up to our customers and our partners and our developers to see where they're going to take it. We just want to make it as available and accessible as possible to enable that.
So I think that mentioning MGP Pro is a good segue to actually discussing more options, how the industry, how your users can actually access the data, right? So you've mentioned the platform, but like, is it the main option for users to access the data, or what are the other possibilities?
Yes. So with 3D data, what's really interesting is there are all these 3D data is a very broad definition. There's all sorts of different types of 3D data. There's surface models which show kind of that first reflection, right? There's kind of an example over my shoulder of what a surface model would look like, where you can see the tops of buildings and vegetation. There's a terrain model which essentially scrapes all that away. And so it depends on what your interest is. Maybe you're only interested in a height model of buildings, right? So there's all these different types of 3D models and 3D data that are available. It's a little more complicated than 2D. And so in order for us to align with all these different applications and use cases, for example, if you're building out a 5G telco network, you need a very different type of 3D data than if you're doing flood risk modeling. It's not the same data set, right? Whereas if you're just trying to get a pretty picture of the planet, they would both use that similar kind of natural color, pretty image. So what we're doing is we're building the world out in 3D in a way that you can order any of these different types of models, DSMs, DTMs, DHMs, other derived products like clutter data sets that identify, the difference between vegetation in developed areas in waterways, for example. And so we want to take all these different capabilities and make them, available in the format that the customer needs, delivered in the way that the customer needs. And we're kind of, we're not starting over. When we first started with 2D, when I first started here, we actually used to ship CDs and hard drives of data. And it's crazy. I'm starting to make myself sound old here to think about how we used to do things. But we've really moved away from that. Now with 3D, we're starting to think again about, well, how is the best way to disseminate this? And we do continue to ship data offline. Some people need access to imagery in a disconnected environment or behind a firewall, and we can format that data the way it's needed and ship it offline, or we can stream it and host it on our own web-based platforms so that application developers can easily integrate those APIs into their products. So it's really a lot of trying to understand, well, what are the primary use cases and needs, and let's start to tackle those and make sure we provide 3D data the way they need it, and then continue to expand out to those more niche use cases to make sure that we can address everyone's needs.
For those of you who don't know what a CD is, it's one of those flashy things that looks like a disc. It's nothing to do with 3D. Because I'm pretty sure there are going to be a lot of young listeners out there listening to Josh. But
Good disclaimer.
Josh, it's been an absolute blast talking to you, and I'm really happy that I am part of the geospatial industry because it's really awesome. But I do have one question before I let you go. How do you see high-resolution 3D data and products evolving in the geospatial industry? Where do you envision us being in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. If you asked me that question 5 to 10 years ago, there's no way I would have predicted that we'll be where we are now. So it's a fun question to ask, and I will attempt to answer it, but it could go in so many different directions. I guess my overall prediction would be that we will continue to build out a higher resolution model of the planet in both 2D and 3D. And we will continue to address all those different niche applications and requirements that people have, whether it's, like we said earlier, the leaf on and leaf off, or winter and summer, or morning and evening. All these different use cases require slightly different data sets. And I think what we're going to see is the continuation of building essentially these customized models of the planet so that everyone has exactly the model that they need to answer their question or deliver the value that they want to deliver to the market. And it will all start with having that, source content that is incredibly high quality, whatever your definition of quality is, right? Accuracy or spatial resolution or temporal resolution, having that currency. We want to be able to serve every one of those different use cases. And I think the future will really be decided based on how our partners, our customers, whether it's government or enterprise or consumer, choose to integrate all this incredible imagery and data into the products that they want to serve out to users. So I think it's really about kind of mass customization and the ability to say, I don't just need a skin of the planet. I need a skin of the planet that works for my application and my use case. And that's what we want to enable.
Thanks a lot. It's been an absolute blast talking to you. And fun fact, it's the first time that we're actually recording a GeoAwesome talk with Maxar. And it makes me very proud because 13 years ago when Aleks started GeoAwesomeness, and we are now GeoAwesome, not GeoAwesomeness anymore, I don't think we would have been able to predict that we would be talking to you today about 3D and precision 3D and what it means. So that's also very cool for us.
And from my end, I can only say that it's so exciting to see 3D actually being democratized in the geospatial industry. From the perspective of kind of a GIS engineer, it's been always a bit of a struggle and challenge to work with 3D. So what you guys do, I think that it can really accelerate the adoption of 3D data in a lot of new applications that we didn't think about before. So it's super exciting. Josh, thanks for joining us today, and see you around.
Yep. Thank you guys as well. It's been awesome for sure.